with Eric Weissberg, and I haven't really figured this out. I don't know if all four people want to come and sit up here now, or maybe I can just read about you and then bring you up. What do you guys want to do? You want to come up one by one? You want me to just introduce? Yeah? Why don't you come up? So we've got Eric Weissberg and Tommy Ramone and Fred Smith and Olga Gentile. And I really appreciate them all both agreeing to do this and showing up. That's a big part of it. I've got one of these in the city next week, and I've been freaking out about people giving me last-minute cancellations. So, great. All right, so I'm going to start with introducing Eric, and this is from a chapter called "The Ballad of Washington Square Park." And this is not the draft that's in the book. So this is something I kind of wrote earlier, but it's. I figured in a way you get something, a little special here. Barely 2 Manhattan miles separated the neighborhoods, but the Tokens hit recording of Wimoway, As the Lion Sleeps Tonight, marked one of the only occasions that the Brooklyn kids who came to dominate Midtown's hit-making factories ever acknowledged the folk traditions of Greenwich Village, or vice versa. For the best part of a decade, it was as if the two music scenes ran on parallel tracks, like grand Manhattan avenues destined never to meet. Yet all the while that the Brill Building kids were running rampant in the charts, a new generation of villagers had been picking up where the Almanac Singers and the Weavers left off. Some called them Woody's children, some preferred the term Pete Seeger's children, and others simply referred to them as red diaper babies. These were the children born to politically progressive parents and gifted in an equivalently enlightened education. They may have attended the Little Red Schoolhouse on Bleecker Street and its related middle and high school named for founder Elizabeth Irwin. Many of them went to the city's elite public high schools, those like Music and Arts in Harlem, the Bronx School of Science, or Brooklyn Tech, that accepted students on merit, not neighborhood. And typically, they spent their summers at sleepaway camps outside the city, either as students or, in their later teens, as counselors. There was considerable overlap between these educational institutions and the music world. Earl Robinson, while blacklisted in the 1950s, became head of Elizabeth Irwin's music program. The Little Red Schoolhouse was beneficiary of a town hall concert that featured Paul Draper and the Almanac Singers. Camp Woodland, near the village of Phoenicia in Ulster County, sponsored the Catskill Folk Festival each summer. Before they joined the Weavers, Ronnie Gilbert and Fred Hellerman spent a summer working at the integrated Camp Walchika, the workers' children's camp sponsored by the International Workers Order in New Jersey, where Paul Robeson was an annual performer. And the ubiquitous Pete Seeger, who never lost his belief in the power of communal singing nor its positive impact on children, played regularly at the Little Red Schoolhouse, performed at all the major summer camps, and in the immediate post-war years even held Saturday morning wingdings for local children in his McDougal Street apartment, where his fellow performers included Woody Guthrie, Leadbelly, Brownie and Sonny, and Cisco Houston. Think of it, recalled Eric Weissberg, one of the kids who attended the wingdings. We were listening to these people when we were little kids, barely playing. Kind of weird to quote you when he's sitting next to me. It's the quote he gave me. When Seeger, at his own father's suggestion, decided to write a banjo manual and held classes to help formulate the project, an 8-year-old Weissberg was among his first students. Weissberg recalled of his classic folk education, he attended Little Red, Elizabeth Irwin and Camp Woodland, as well as taking lessons from Seeger, that it was progressive and liberal, it was integrated, but that I never once heard the word communist. Rather, he maintained, his teachers, the musicians included, instilled in him the core concept of brotherhood, a value that, because it could not be taken for granted everywhere else in America, came to be closely associated with folk music. Folk music was a very integral part of the liberal left experience, said Mary Travers, who attended both the Little Red Schoolhouse and Elizabeth Irwin High School. It was writers, sculptors, painters, whatever, listening to Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, the Weavers. People sang in Washington Square Park on Sundays, and you really did not have to have a lot of talent to sing folk music. You needed enthusiasm, which is all folk music asks. It asks that you care. The Washington Square Park gatherings began immediately after the war, when George Margolin, a professional printer and amateur musician, began leading impromptu sing-songs around the fountain, which offered a natural performance space leading back to a small amphitheatre of seats. In addition, the village had already developed a reputation for social inclusion and musical tradition, and the park was its public gathering ground, with an especially young clientele given its proximity to an expanding New York university. In these late 1940s, folk music was still but a small part of the Park Sunday scene. There were fire eaters and violinists alike. There was what George Sprung, he's one of the founders there, called the last of the Bohemians, a drunken Maxwell Bodenheim selling his poems by the sheep. And there were Italian bands roaming the benches, performing their own traditional songs for spare change. The aging Italian immigrants, who had long been the mainstay of the village, were less than enamoured by the liberal youths that gathered with guitars and banjos to sing all afternoon and evening, and soon enough the police put pressure on the musicians to either show up with a permit or not show up at all. Everyone was in a big crowd when I first got there, said Eric Darling, a future folk figurehead. If you knew the songs, you were in the centre of the crowd. If you didn't have the slightest idea what you were doing, you were on the outside of the crowd, and some people just didn't give a shit, didn't know what they were doing and sang anyway. It was very egalitarian. Roger Sprung, that's George Sprung's brother, was soon joined in his bluegrass fascination by fellow banjo player Willie Dykeman and fiddle player Danny Zemmickson, who played his instrument Appalachian style, across the stomach rather than under the neck. On hearing Sprung and Dykeman in 1951, 11-year-old Eric Weissberg was instantly converted from Pete Seeger's banjo style, in which, by Pete Seeger's own admission, within a month or two of taking lessons, Weissberg was playing rings around me, to the bluegrass picking style. I have to give them a lot of credit. They encouraged me, showed me stuff, Weissberg recalled of the older Park players. Like Sprung before him, Weissberg learned bluegrass from the few records that made it to New York City, and was soon good enough to hold court by the fountain with his own friend, Marshall Brickman. I'm just going to fast forward about Eric here to the late 50s. And the scene now has really taken off in Greenwich Village, like really taken off, and people are starting to move to the city to make it, and in terms of the Washington Square Park. With the exception of John Hammond at Columbia, the only established record label to show any interest in the burgeoning folk scene was, typically, Atlantic. In 1960, it signed the Tarriers, whose lineup now featured Bob Carey, the stirring gospel voice of Clarence Cooper, and the flamboyant banjo playing of a grown Eric Weissberg. The trio's racial integration intrigued Atlantic, which recorded their album Tell the World About This that spring, with the Weavers' Ronnie Gilbert supplying sleeve notes that bemoaned the lack of authenticity in the current folk scene. In doing so, Gilbert inadvertently helped define a generation gap that was growing between the Weavers and their offspring. The traditionalists resented people changing things, said Weissberg. I grew up in the traditional environment, listening to Pete and Woody and those guys, but I learned new chords when I was in school. Learned a 6th chord or a 9th chord and thought, that sounds nice. We weren't trying to belittle anything that we were singing. It remained one of the folk scene's inherent contradictions that such an open-minded, inclusive culture could prove narrow-minded and reactionary when it came to the music. For with the exception of Harry Smith's remarkable anthology of American folk music, the same old songs were constantly regurgitated by the same old and young artists on the same old and new labels. Rambling Jack Elliott sings the songs of Woody Guthrie. Dave Van Ronk sings ballads, blues and spirituals. Pete Seeger's folk songs for young people. Elektra Records even signed Josh White and issued a fresh album of Chain Gang songs 15 years after the original. In such a climate, Tell the World About This was arguably ahead of its time, and Atlantic, unable to figure out the market, gave up without releasing a single. As we know, Eric went on to do wonderful things, and thank you, Eric, for being here. That's Eric's background.